I grew up a long way from the mountains in the south of England, but looking out from our garden I could see the hills of the South Downs, which are maybe 300 feet above sea level. But there's an old psalm in the Bible about I shall lift my eyes up into the hills, and I think I was always drawn to the hills. And when I was 8, I first went to the Lake District, to North Wales, to Scotland, and saw big hills. And then when I was 9, I went for the first time to the European Alps to go skiing, and that was the most exciting adventure, just to see those great snow.
And who you are going with your parents or with friends?
I was always with the family. I didn't know any climbers. There aren't many climbers in the south of England. So my introduction to the hills was through my family, through my parents. They didn't climb, but they liked skiing and they liked... My father liked fishing, so usually we would go for a walk, and we always had to stop and have a picnic wherever there was a lake or a river where you could fish, and then maybe we would carry on up a mountain. Can I just suggest one thing, Harry?
Yeah.
If you were to sit in the gap here, then when you're asking questions, the eye line will be to
no, but you need not look into the camera. You can look at me and talk.
All right, okay.
You can look at me and talk.
Fine.
No
Shut up. I take it this is going to be edited.
No, it's okay. You can go on.
All right, okay. You can cut out the bits like that. Okay. So seeing the Alps for the first time was incredibly exciting. The anticipation. I remember for weeks beforehand my father was in the workshop with some old skis, taking the edges off, putting on new edges, polishing them, repainting them, checking the bindings, and then we tried them out in the house doing kick turns, and then eventually the big day came when we got in the car. We went to Dover, and then we went in a boat across the sea. I'd never done that before, and then drove across France, and eventually after 2 days driving we came over a high pass one night and we looked down, and there were the lights of the Engadine Valley with the lights reflected in the snow. And we arrived at about long after dark. It was probably 9 o'clock at night. And my brother and I said, "Can we go skiing tonight? Can we get the skis out?" And he said, "No, you've got to get to bed." So the next morning we were up at 5 o'clock in the morning, getting dressed, putting on all our ski trousers and gloves and hats, and getting out the skis. And then we went out to play in the snow. It was fantastic.
And which was the first mountain you saw or skied down in Alps? Any special memories?
Well, I remember that first time to the Alps, above St. Moritz and Pontresina. Occasionally we'd go up on one of the big cable cars, and from there you could see across to the Bernina Alps, and that was my first sight of glaciers, the glaciated mountains. And that was very exciting. And I think always at the back of my mind was the idea of climbing these mountains. Because I'd read books about it. I'd read Banner in the Sky by James Ramsey Ullman. It's a fictional book about the Matterhorn. I'd read, I think it's a young husband book, The Epic of Everest. So I'd read about the early Everest attempts. When I was quite young, I got Alan Blackshaw's Penguin Book of Mountaineering, all about mountaineering. It was the Bible. So I was reading about it and hearing about it, but not having much direct experience.
This was at the age of what, 8 or 10 you went for skiing?
Yeah, I first went skiing when I was 9, and I've been back to the Alps almost every year since. So it's now it's now coming up to 50 years of continuous, almost continuous visits to the Alps.
And which are the famous routes have you climbed?
Ah, well, that came much later. I mean, when I didn't really start climbing till I was 17.
But till that point you were just holidaying and skiing? Yes,
and little walks, bit of scrambling. I used to go out climbing on my own, bouldering. Before, now they bouldering is a sport, and they have special mats and special equipment. No, I just went bouldering. I just did it because rocks ask to be climbed. Rock is beautiful. It's tactile and it's irresistible. So at the seaside, I was always climbing on the cliffs, finding nice boulders. But I did a little bit of climbing when I was 13. I did a bit more when I was 16 with some friends near Fontainebleau in France. And then when I was 17, I thought I really must do something about this. So I heard there was a boy in the village who climbed, who was a bit younger than me, so I phoned up and said, will you take me climbing? So we went on climbing. And basically I learned climbing by trying it out. So I never went on an instructional course. And it shows, I still don't know how to do things properly. so it was learning by trial and error. So right from the start I was leading. And I had some narrow escapes. And it was trial and error, and you just hope the errors aren't fatal. And then, so I started climbing and leading climbs, and then I went to university at Oxford, which had quite a thriving mountaineering club. So I started to get to know other mountaineers.
So what were you studying in Oxford?
I should have studied history. I was quite good at history, but I was obstinate, and I insisted on studying English literature and language, which I didn't do very successfully. And there were still huge gaps in my knowledge of the great canon of English literature. But I ended up getting a second degree. Actually, at the end of my second year, at the end of that summer term, I was at New College, which is actually a very old college. It's nearly 600 years old, but I was a very venerable college with some very distinguished people in the English faculty. And I hadn't done much work, and I was summoned to see the warden, the head of the college. And he said, Mr. Venables, so far this term, Mr. Buxton says he's only seen you once when you produced one diminutive essay. And Mrs. I can't remember her name, another tutor, says he hasn't seen you at all since Easter. I'm afraid this is not good enough. We're going to have to do some work. And unless your attitude improves, we'll have to send you down. We'll have to throw you out. So I trust you'll spend the whole of the summer vacation reading and working. It's very, very contrite. And I probably went off to the Alps for 2 months. Didn't do any work at all. But in the final year, I managed eventually to get a grip and pass my degree.
So that was in which year you passed your degree?
1975 I graduated, and then soon after finishing at Oxford, we went for a wonderful trip, a long walk through the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, and then I went off to the Alps for 9 weeks.
This was now with Oxford friends or still?
Yeah, it was usually with Oxford friends. That was my third Alpine season, and I was very keen. There were so many great climbs I wanted to do. I was dreaming of all these great climbs, and usually the reality fell far short of the dream. But that's the nature of life. But it's good to have things to dream about too. But that summer, I didn't really have anyone to climb with, a regular partner. So I went out, and in those days, a lot of British and other nationalities of climbers used to hang out in this field in Chamonix called Snell's Field, and it was a bit like a sort of slum town with these makeshift polythene shelters. It's probably a real health hazard. Anyway, that's where all the climbers hung out, and so quite often you could meet people to climb with. And I did various quite good climbs. The previous summer I'd done the famous north face of Rapidille. On this occasion, in '75, I did the north face of the Aiguille Verte, east face of the Crepon, various quite good routes, north face of the Court. And it was that summer I met a man called Lindsay Griffin, who was older than me, more experienced than me, and a very genial, likeable fellow. He seemed to have all the right ideas about mountaineering. He was interested in exploring odd corners of the world that weren't very well known. And he had a huge appetite for mountaineering. And right at the end of that season, everyone else had gone home. And by default, Lindsay ended up having to climb with me. So I was very pleased one day. He said, hey, we should go and do some routes together. Anyway, before the autumn weather arrived, we did one climb called the north face of the Grande Casse in the Vanoise Alps, and that was the first of many adventures together. And it was about a year later, Lindsay said, hey, should we go winter climbing in the Alps? And that was a whole new game. And he also said, how about coming to Afghanistan to go climbing in the Hindu Kush? And that was my first big expedition overseas in 1977.
So where did you go in Afghanistan?
Well, in 77, this expedition started with Lindsay Griffin and Roger Everett, who'd both been at Oxford. And then they invited me, and they invited another friend called David Lund, and a girl called Julia Yeomans, who's become an extremely distinguished professor of theoretical physics. Anyway, the five of us went to the Wakhan in the northeast corner of Afghanistan to climb the Khazi Day, which is a valley it's one of the valleys that stretches south off the Wakhan from the Oxus River, leading up into the Hindu Kush to the border between Afghanistan and Chitral. And at the head of that valley, there's a huge 7,500 meter peak called Noshak, which is probably the most popular 7,000 in the world at that time. It's been climbed many times. So there was the chance to see what it was like to go to high altitude, extreme altitude, but also the fun bit was to climb new routes on some of the lower peaks, around between 5,000 and 6,000 meters. And for me, the real treat was to, with Roger and Lindsay, to spend 3 days traversing a peak called Kohi Saft by a completely new route. And that was the first time I'd ever done a completely new route on beautiful granite, enjoyable climbing, bivouacking 3 times on the mountain, glorious sunsets looking out west over Badakhshan, and just to have that peace and serenity of the whole mountain range to ourselves. We did make an attempt on the normal route on Noshak, and I think Lindsay and I were quite futuristic, because this was 1977. We'd heard about what Messer and Harbler had done on Hidden Peak, what human beings could do at altitude. The following year they were going to do Everest without oxygen. So there was this whole new move afoot to climb fast and light. So we thought, let's see if we can do it too. And the first day, I think we climbed about 6,000 or 7,000 feet in a single day, straight up to over 6,000 meters. And then we just sort of ground to a halt. The following day, we had a rest day, and then we staggered on about another few hundred meters. And it was just interminable looking up this interminable snowy rim, very easy angled, plodding through the snow. And then we got to high camp, and then again we just ground to a halt. The following day, Roger Everest and David Lund came up to join us. They'd come up more slowly. And then on the 5th day, I think it was, we continued, hoping to continue towards the summit. And at about 7,000 meters, maybe a bit higher, I just felt like death, this appalling lassitude. And suddenly the weather looked a bit iffy, there was a cloud in the sky. At which point David said, I'm going down, anyone coming? And we just turned around and went back. Nothing was said, we just went straight back down again. So that was my first experience of high altitude. It was rather sobering.
And the locals were still very friendly, and Russians had not arrived there?
No, that was 1977. Afghanistan was interesting at that time. It was still very much on the tourist trail, the overland trail. I mean, Lindsay and I, we went out overland by bus. So there were a lot of tourists based around Chicken Street in Kabul, a lot of sort of remnants of hippie culture. But Russian presence was very, very obvious. There was Russian goods in the shops, Russian cars, Russian advisors. To get to Badakhshan, you drove up the road which the Russians built through the Salang Pass, which heads straight to the Russian frontier. So it was sort of quite obvious what the game plan was. So it didn't come as much of a surprise. The following year there was a coup, Daoud was ousted, and the following year, New Year 1979, the Russians invaded. So having been there, it didn't seem a great surprise. But it was quite strange in '77 being in the Oxus Valley, because you looked across the Oxus River, and there, 200 yards away, was the enemy, and this was still the Cold War. And on the other side, you could see they had street lights, they had metal roads, traffic driving backwards and forwards. This superior, rich power, and there they were, just sort of poised.
So after returning, then what were your plans?
Well, I returned from Afghanistan, like many occasions of my life, with no fixed plans. Just an idea.
But you never wanted to work or join a...
I never wanted to work.
Never?
No, I always wanted to work. I always dreamt of achieving great things. I had been surviving at that stage off odd jobs, bits of carpentry, gardening, all sorts of things. And then in 1978, I thought I needed to get a proper job. And I was tempted to follow my father into the advertising industry, which he had worked in with great success, rising to the top of his profession. But I just couldn't really, I didn't feel that my heart could be in it. So like many people, I compromised and said I'll become a school teacher. And so I trained to be a school teacher, and for 3 years I worked as a school teacher. Well, I did a year sort of on probation, then I did a teacher training course, and then I did 2 years teaching English and music at a school in York in the north of England. And by the end of the second year I realised my heart wasn't really in this.
But you were living in Bath or which place?
I'd been living in Oxford, London. At this stage, by 1980 I was living in York.
And your family was?
My parents at that stage lived in Bath, in the southwest of England. They moved there in 1977. I'd been continuing to go on expeditions. I'd been back to the Himalayas in '79 with my brother.
Okay, where was this?
That was to Hunza. '79, I think we did the whole trip for about £300. And we arrived in Delhi and got the overnight bus to Amritsar. God, it was an education. And then eventually made our way over the Wagah border, and eventually got to Islamabad, and eventually, after many trials and getting permits, we got up the Karakoram highway to Hunza. I think it took 2 weeks to get from London to Hunza.
Oh my God.
And then anyway, it was wonderful to see the Karakoram for the first time. My brother Philip and I made the first ascent of a little peak above the Hunza Valley. It was one of the best summits I've ever been to. Stunning dawn views of the whole up Hisbar Glacier, all the way up to the Oga, Kunya, Kish, Parish Range to the south, Malabiti, west to Rakaposhi, north to Shimshal. Sligo. Okay. Do you want me to go back? Okay. So that was thrilling, and then we made our way back to Delhi, and then we went up to Kishtwar.
Same trip, immediately went.
Yeah, we went to Kishtwar. I'd heard about this beautiful area, and I thought I've got to go there. I only knew 3 people who'd been there before: Charlie Clark, and I'd seen his pictures in the Alpine Journal, and I knew Chris Bonington had been there with Nick Escort, and my old friend Lindsay Griffin. He'd been there with a friend called Phil Bartlett, and Lindsay lent me a little sketch map and his diary with prices, how much a cup of tea costs in Kishtwar, everything I needed to know. And so Philip and I set off for Kishtwar, and we headed up towards the Amartya. And we didn't get over the Amartya, but it was then that I just saw Kishtwar for the first time. And it was
you were coming from Zanskar?
No, we came from the south. No,
from the south.
Yeah, we came up from Jammu to Kishtwar town. And in those days, you could get a bus to a place called Galar, and that was as far as the road went. And for me, that was what was so magical, this ancient mule trail up the Chenab. And of course, because there was no road, the forestry was limited to what could be taken out by hand, so the forests were still intact, these glorious deodar mixed forest. And then we went up that side mill, I can't remember what it's called, up towards Machail, and then up round to Shumchan. And the first thing we did was to try and get over the Kangshung Face, and with my innate ability to miss the obvious route, I went up a side valley, missed the main pass. We ended up way above the Kangshung Face on the crest of the ridge, looking down this horrendous ice slope, and it was dusk. And ever foolish, I said to my younger brother, well, we'll go down here. And he had no crampons, but I had crampons and 60 feet of rope. So I said, oh, don't worry, I'll be able to lower you down 60 feet at a time. And my brother, who's younger and more sensible than me, said, yeah, I'm not sure that's a very good idea. So we retraced our steps. And it was whilst retracing our steps back down that nullah, it was one of those glorious autumn mornings, and everything's, you know, that wonderful glitter and blue light and the haze lifting, and everything's just effulgent. And it was like a kind of epiphany, because there, framed in the V of this side valley, was this beautiful mountain called Shivling. Not the Shivling in Galwa, this is another Shivling, Kishtwar Shivling.
And that name was given by you?
I've been told by Griffin. He'd said that this mountain was called Shivling. Someone else said it was called Telangana, so who knows. But anyway, Lindsay had mentioned that there's this mountain called Shivling, and it looks stunning. He said it's like the famous north face of the Droite in France, but about 3 times as big, with a 6,000 metre summit. And there it was just this sort of vision, this perfect mountain. And it looked very hard, and I thought, well, someone good will go and climb it one day. So 4 years later, I thought, well, I'd better go and climb it before someone else does.
Yeah. So you came back to Kishtwar, or in between you had gone somewhere?
No, I went to other expeditions. 1980, Bartlett and Griffin and I decided we'd go to Hunza on the basis of my reconnaissance. We'd go to Hunza and have a go at Ultar, which is one of the highest unclimbed peaks in the world. And then Griffin had a very bad accident in Wales, so he was in hospital, badly injured. So that left Bartlett and me, 2-man team, quite sort of vulnerable. And then that spring, there was a chap called Dave Wilkinson, and he was planning an expedition to the West Karakoram, and he only had 1 member of his expedition. So the 3 of us combined forces, and Wilkie had set his heart on a peak called Kunyang Kish, which is actually one of the highest mountains in the world, off the Hispar Glacier, and he had spotted the possibility of a new route up the north face of Kunyang Kish. So that's what we went to try and do, just the 3 of us. And it was a fantastic expedition, a great experience. And if we had pulled it off, it would have been, I think, quite a coup, just 3 of us on this big new route on a peak of nearly 8,000 metres, but we didn't make it all the way. Got bogged down in bad weather.
So then what next came next?
Well, I got... we had a final attempt on Kunyang Kish in 1980. And again, we were defeated by heavy snowfalls, serious avalanche risk. We retreated safely. It had been the most tremendous, powerful experience, but when we got back to Gilgit, we were late. By making a final attempt, I made myself late for a new teaching job in York. So I sent a telegram. This was before the days of telephone communications. I sent a telegram from Gilgit to the school in York saying, Indus flooded, sorry delays, Venables. Sorry late Venables, that's right. Indus flooded, sorry late Venables. And I arrived 10 days late for a new job. And about a stone and a half underweight.
There was no murmur, they accepted you for this delay.
Yeah, the head was very understanding. In fact, in a way I think the school was quite pleased, because I arrived with quite a sort of flourish. It added a bit of sort of notoriety to the school. Himalayan climber arrives late for the new job. So I think actually they were quite pleased about it.
For all these expeditions, how are you financing them?
We were financing these expeditions essentially by doing them on a shoestring. They were very low budget. We took absolute minimal equipment, minimum supplies, no luxuries, old second-hand tents, small teams, no high-altitude porters, minimal porters to get to base camp. But we still had to pay for permits and things. And we found by keeping the budget low, having no frills, and with the help of grants from the Mount Everest Foundation and the British Mountaineering Council, we could and a bit of sponsorship, we could make them affordable.
Oh.
I mean, for instance, when I went back in 1983, having given up school teaching, decided to become a full-time mountaineer, I went back to Kishtwar to climb Kishtwar Shivling with Dick Renshaw. And for the two of us, I can remember precisely, the entire expedition cost was £2,200. And half of that cost was covered by grants from the British Mountaineering Council and the Mount Everest Foundation. So it costed each of us £650.
At that time I think things were still reasonably, well, a little cheap.
They were affordable. And of course at that time for a European to live in India was comparatively cheap. There was a huge price disparity. So and we stayed at the cheapest hotels. We kept everything. We travelled on public buses, no private vehicles or anything like that. So we had what we needed, but nothing more. And we were young, so we didn't need luxury. So it was possible. So there was a sort of myth amongst the general public that Himalayan climbing involved vast expense. I mean, the classic was the southwest face of Everest, which had a budget of the then gigantic sum of £100,000. But it was possible to do quite significant expeditions for really very low budget.
Yes. So in all this now, Rosie, were you married then or in love, or where did you meet Rosie and how things went on?
Was
she a climber?
Well, excuse me, sorry. As we all know, mountaineers don't make ideal life partners, and during those early expeditions, my relationships tended to be rather fleeting. So I was frequently falling in love, but often the love was unreciprocated. Or if it was reciprocated, it didn't seem to last very long, because I was always disappearing. So that was quite difficult. I certainly used to yearn sometimes for some kind of settled existence and domestic bliss, which generally eluded me. So I led a rather unsettled, peripatetic existence. And at one stage, actually, I said to my parents, "Do you mind if I base myself at your house?" Because at one stage, I was to make money. I was working as a carpenter, building bookcases, and cupboards, and so on. And I was actually working with my father because he'd retired. He was a very skillful cabinet maker. So I worked with him for a while. We used to do these jobs together. So it was very much a hand-to-mouth existence. And I was continuing to go on expeditions. In '84, I went back to the Karakoram.
Where to?
84, I went to the Shimshal Valley, went back with Renshaw, and we climbed some small peaks. 82, I've been to Peru and Bolivia. Yeah, we made some lovely ascents there.
But how did Peru came to the picture? You were all the time Alps and Himalaya. So how come Peru and South America came into the picture?
Well, in 1982, we went to Peru. What happened was, 1981, we spent 2 whole summers attempting Kunar Kish. And on the second occasion, we got even less far than the first time. And while we were there, we used to talk about things. Dave Wilkinson was always reminiscing about the wonders of Peru, and what a wonderful place it was, and how so much easier it is to come to the Himalayas. You don't have to have all these permits and liaison officers and difficulties and long journeys and hassle. And the mountains aren't too high. So in '82, I thought, I'm fed up with this Himalayan thing. Let's go to Peru. So Dave Wilkinson and I went to Peru. We did some beautiful climbs. First ascent in the Cordillera Vilcanota near Cusco. And then we went down to La Paz in Bolivia and met Lindsay Griffin and his wife Jan. And we did some climbs there. So also some new routes. So that was a very nice interlude. And then in '83, I went to Kishtwar Shivling, back to the Himalayas. '84, I came back to the Karakoram, to Pakistan with Renshaw. And '84, I got rather disillusioned with mountaineering, life in general. I felt that my life was going nowhere. And I had a rather miserable experience of being jilted by a girlfriend who clearly realised that there was no future with Venables. So in the autumn of '84, I was feeling pretty depressed, and I had a few carpentry jobs, and I thought, well, I'll get on with them. And then there came this announcement in the Alpine Club Journal, or in the Alpine Club newsletter, that invitation to go to the Siachen Glacier in the Karakoram. And it just sort of caught my imagination. And I sort of thought, this is too good a chance to resist, too good a chance to turn down. So I thought, we're going to make a go of this. So we got in touch with the Indian Mountaineering Federation, and we decided, yeah, we're going to go for this. And with Wilkie and various other people, Dick Renshaw, no, Renshaw couldn't come, Jim Folleringham, Victor Saunders, we put together a team. And I did a lot of work on raising sponsorship with a great deal of help from the Alpine Club president, Roger Chorley. It was great. We pulled strings on our behalf. And we put this thing together, and then at the last minute we got this letter from this chap Kapadia in Bombay saying that the Bombay Mountaineers would like to be our co-climbers, and Kapadia would lead the expedition. And so we set off that May on what was one of the great adventures of my life, and it actually reaffirmed my faith in Himalayan mountaineering.
So what was the experiences on that trip? I mean, it was a war zone, and could you just narrate a bit? And your climb of Remo 1, attempt on Remo 1?
It was very exciting. It was very exciting, that expedition, because we set off from London not knowing exactly where we were going. Initially, we thought we were going right up the Siachen Glacier to what we called the Asparagus Group, which is the Apsarasas Mountains. And then we arrived in Mumbai and we were told no, we couldn't go there. We were going to go to Sasakangri 4. And I got very excited about Sasakangri 4, big, high, unclimbed mountain. And then at the very last moment, I think the authorities said, no, you can't go to Sasakangri. You're going to the Remo Group. And we knew virtually nothing about the Remo Group. But we knew that Tom Longstaff had said back in 1909, if any party would like to explore an interesting valley, all they have to do is set off up the Siachen Glacier and then take the first turning on the right into the Terong Valley, because there's a whole mountain basin there to be explored. And that's what we set off to do. And for me, one of the highlights of that expedition was arriving with Meena Agrawal one morning. We were the last to arrive there. At that point on the Siachen Glacier, we looked down into this valley, and you just see this typical braided Karakoram River, and it goes around a cliff and disappears, and you don't know what lies beyond. Because there were no photos had been published of that side of Remo. So we didn't know what was there, and the only way to find out was to go and look. So it felt like real exploration. And it was a great expedition. It was, right from the beginning, it was fun. We had great company. It was a great gastronomic tour with Kapadia. Lots of feasting, lots of partying, lots of fun. And this sense of heading off into the unknown. And another highlight was about a week later, when we finally established advanced base camp on the upper Terong Glacier, And we arrived in cloud, and then one evening there was this magical lifting of the clouds. It was very theatrical. And then gradually this great monumental architectural mountain of Remo 1, 2, and Remo 3, all three of them revealed themselves. And everyone was shouting at once, look at that buttress there, look at that ridge there, oh, maybe we could go that way, maybe we could go that way. And it was just fantastic. And eventually, 4 of the British members of the team attempted a new route. Well, the first ever attempt on Remo 1. And it was a long, difficult route. It was quite early in the season, wasn't it? It was, it was the beginning of
June.
Late June.
We were there by
towards the end of June. There's still a lot of snow around. And we ended up on this quite knife-edged ridge with lots and lots of towers and turrets, with not brilliant rock, with these great blobs of snow cornices overlaying it. So the kind of climbing, which is very arduous, very, very slow, very, very meticulous, sort of climbing you just can't rush. And on the 3rd day, Fotheringham and Wilkinson said they really didn't like the look of it. We should go back down. But Saunders and I decided we felt it was worth persisting, so we continued. And we had 4 of the best days of my life, just working our way slowly up this ridge, very slowly. Only a few rope lengths each day. I was climbing with Saunders, Victor Saunders, who's a brilliant alpinist. So it was a great treat to be climbing with him. And we alternated leads all the way. We had some precarious bivouacs with our little tent perched in some amazing situations. But we slowly made progress. And then on the 6th day of that climb, when we were getting to about 7,000 meters, that evening, in an appalling moment of clumsiness, failed to clip my rucksack in. My rucksack started tumbling, and it fell at least 1,000 meters down the other side of the ridge. And because it contained tent poles, stove, sleeping bag, all sorts of essentials, particularly the stove, I think if we kept the stove, we could have melted snow, we could have carried on. Victor was absolutely adamant to be 2 people isolated at 7,000 meters on one of the highest unclimbed peaks in the world without the ability to melt snow. This was too dangerous, so we had to pack it in and go down. And immediately after the accident, I almost had a nervous breakdown. I was hysterical with rage, impotent rage. In fact, Victor thought I was going to throw myself off the mountain. I eventually calmed down, and we had a miserable night, shivering and suffering from this terrible thirst. And in the morning, feeling utterly miserable, I set off down, and we had to do a series of abseiles. Very committing abseiles. We headed up down through unknown terrain, direct. I remember at one stage we abseiled down this very steep terrain, and I got to the end of the ropes, and I fixed up a belay with a big sling around a great projecting spike of rock. And at that point, the ropes were actually hanging in space. Victor came down to join me. We were on overhanging terrain, and then we had the ultimate nightmare when you pull on the rope and it's stuck. You think, oh my God, here we are in the middle of this great overhanging face with the rope stuck above us, thousands of feet below to get down. Anyway, thank God, eventually the rope came free and we were able to continue down. And late that evening we got back down to Lance Face. A bitter disappointment. And what made it particularly agonising was that if the weather had then clapped out, we could have said, oh, thank goodness we retreated. We wouldn't have got caught in that storm, but it didn't. The weather stayed perfect for the next week. I mean, almost unprecedented. We had such brilliant weather on that expedition. So there was this awful knowledge that we would have made it, probably. We would have got to the summit.
And later in the expedition also, I believe you climbed a few peaks?
Yes, well the great thing about that expedition is, apart from my cock-up on Remo 1, it was a huge success, because I mean, Wilkinson and Fotheringham made the first ascent of Remo 3, Agrawal and Boga went round onto the South Remo Glacier and they made first ascents, Kapadia and Contractor and Tulsidas and all the others were making several first ascents. All of us were covering a huge area of these three big glaciers, the Terong, the South Terong and the Shelpa Chalkman, which I went up, and that was what I did in the final stages of the expedition. You know, like I climbed a peak called Chalkman Peak and another peak called Nabal Terong. So almost by way of penance for my incompetence on Remo 1, I went and climbed these other peaks.
And did you see any of these wars, Siachen war going on? Because this was just in infancy, but most at its peak almost to start with.
One bizarre aspect of that whole expedition, which was quite exciting actually, was that we were basically climbing in a war zone, and we were only there as guests really in the Indian Army. We started from the main army base at the head of the Nubra Valley, and we had this bizarre experience on Remo of every morning, shortly after dawn, hearing the artillery, the heavy artillery in the distance over towards the Villafond Labs, the south, which was a very surreal experience, and occasionally seeing supply helicopters flying up the glacier. And on the way out of the Terong Valley, there was considerable nervousness because some of the party had to leave early. Saunders, Fotheringham, and a chap called Henry Osbaston, a scientist who joined us, they had to leave and they had to go down to the army base, and they ended up coming down at twilight, at dusk. And we'd been told on no account should anyone go near the army base after dark, because we could be mistaken for Pakistani spies and could be shot on sight. So apparently Henry Osbaston headed off down the glacier holding up his ice axe with a white handkerchief on the end of his ice axe, shouting at the top of his voice, "We're not spies, we're not spies." Anyway, they weren't shot.
So in between you did not mention much about Kishtawar Shivling. That was before this or after this?
Right. Yes, one of my best expeditions of all, perhaps the one of which I have the fondest memories, was that in 1983 I went back to Kishtawar Shivling. I'd given up school teaching, I had all sorts of plans, great climbs I wanted to do, but I thought one thing I particularly wanted to do was this unclimbed peak of Kishtawar Shivling, because I thought if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So in 1983, in the winter, I went out to the Alps with Dick Renshaw, and we climbed a very remote climb called the northeast face of the Finstrahorn in the Alps. First attempted by Gertrude Bell in 1902. And that was a tremendous winter climb, a week on a mountain in the dead of winter. Good preparation. And we were successful, a rare occurrence. And Dick could tolerate my company, and we seemed to climb on together. And then I went back to Lucerne in Switzerland, where I was living for a while with a wonderful girlfriend called Marianne. But that came to an end, like all things, like all good things. And at the end of the summer, I set off back to India with Renshaw, and we arrived out here at the end of August, and we made our way back to that valley in Kishtawar, to that beautiful mountain which I'd seen 4 years earlier. And well, we spotted, Dick was very much the senior partner. He spotted the obvious line up this great north face, the obvious, fairly safe line, but with some difficult climbing. And after a reconnaissance, we set off, and essentially we spent 7 days going up and down the north face. And it was one of those climbs that, like all the best climbs, it was like a piece of music. It had a rhythm, a structure, a flow to it. and themes were repeated. There were moments of climax, and it was building up to the sort of grand climax of the summit day. It was just a wonderful climb. And for me it was particularly good because it seemed to encompass everything that for me is good about mountaineering. It was a journey into the unknown. It was a beautiful mountain. Every individual pitch was beautiful. There was snow climbing, ice climbing, mixed climbing. And there were moments on it where I felt I was making up for all the past climbs that I'd failed on or not managed to do. And it seemed to be sort of quintessence of everything that was good about alpinism. So it was just tremendous.
Oh, great.
And it went more or less according to plan, but it didn't go entirely according to plan. And when we got to our fourth bivouac, perched on the summit ridge, inevitably the weather turned bad. On the summit day, we were actually in cloudy weather. So, shall we go, shall we wait? And we thought, well, we've got to try. So we set off in quite murky weather for the summit. And we didn't get to the summit till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And by that stage it was starting to snow. And I was dreading the retreat because we left all our bivouac gear down at the bivouac. And I actually, it turned out the summit, it was extraordinary because you climb this immense precipice. And then on the final pitch, I happened to be my turn to lead. And Rachel said, okay, go on, off you go. So I'm plodding up, exhausted. And then kicking steps, and then it eased off. And then just suddenly I popped out onto this great white plateau in the clouds. First human being ever to stand there. Great feeling. And Dick came up to join me, and we took a picture of us, just there in this sort of murk. And then I said, well, hey Dick, I can't face descending that. Why don't we just dig a snow cave here and wait till the morning? He said, well, you're bloody crazy. don't be total nonsense. Well, up here, no sleeping bags. No, we're going right down now. So immediately we set off down, and that was quite a battle because as we set off back down the north face, it was starting to snow quite heavily. So it was building up spindrift, and these spindrift avalanches were pouring down, and the snow was getting down your neck, and we were abseiling down into this whiteout, trying to work out where to go. And we were doing diagonal abseiles, which is always difficult. And eventually we had to traverse, crab crawling back across some terrifyingly steep snow flutings and ice runnels. And to cut a long story short, we didn't get back to bed until nearly midnight. So it was a long summit day, and I felt we'd really been tested. And then another 2 days to get back down the mountain. But it did leave you completely fulfilled.
Yes. So after 85, next year was Siachen, and after Siachen, where were you? Next 2 years, 86, 87?
Well, the nice thing after 85 was we returned home with all these new friends in India, and before setting off home from Bombay, I sat down in the house of Muslim contractor and wrote out a synopsis for a book, because I'd always wanted to write. Like everyone, I dreamed of writing a book. And I thought, well, if I don't do something about this, it's never going to happen. So I thought this Siachen expedition had been such a great story, it would be good to try and write it up. And I thought I'd combine it with Kishtwar Shivling, because the two were both in Kashmir. And I thought the Kishtwar story was also a great story. So I wrote a synopsis, and when I got back to England, I thought I would strike while the iron is hot. And so I got this synopsis typed up on an electric typewriter. This was before the days of word processors. Got it to look good, made a nice presentation, and I sent it off. About a month after getting home, I sent off this package, or in a sample chapter, to Hodder and Stoughton, famous publishers of mountain travel books. And that was the bravest thing I ever did, actually, sending that off to Hodder and Stoughton. And about a month later, a phone call came from Maggie Boddy, the editor at Podders, saying, I think you're going to have to come up to London and have a meeting. And then I got there and she said, I think we're going to have to make you an offer. So that was very exciting. So that was the big project when I got back from the Siachen. I got an advance from Hobbenstadt, and I knew that money could keep me going until Christmas. So I had until Christmas to write the book. And for me, that was a great thrill. It was a whole new adventure to sit down and immerse myself in writing my first book.
I didn't know this was your first book.
Yes, first book. It was a great dream come true. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, generally I hate writing, it's a terrible chore, but I did actually enjoy doing that first book. And it's hard work, very hard work. But yes, for 10 weeks I was just immersed in it. And I stayed initially with my brother and his wife, and then with some friends, cousins actually. Cut off from the rest of the world. No one knew my phone number, and that was a great treat to be able to do that, thanks to their hospitality. And yes, and I delivered the manuscript in time before Christmas.
That book was a great success, I believe.
Well, yeah, the book was quite well received. It was published the following autumn in 1986. So in the summer of 1986, the sad thing though, was returning to reality, because before finishing that first book, I put in a proposal for a second book, but they weren't sure about that. So after Christmas, I had to return to building cupboards. And then in the summer of '86, I spent quite a lot of time returning to roots and going back to summer climbing in the European Alps. And that was actually tremendous fun, doing some of the great classic alpine routes, which I'd always wanted to do. Initially with someone called Henry Todd, we did the north face of the Droite and the north face of the Aiguille Plein, which I actually soloed. We climbed the Guillemina on the south side of Mont Blanc. These are all famous routes. And then I went back again in the late summer with a fellow furniture making friend called Luke Hughes, and we did the famous north face of the Eiger, which was something I dreamt of doing for at least 15 years, and that was a dream come true. And then I got back from the Eiger, back to London, and my book was published. Very exciting.
Yeah.
And then at the time I was working for Luke in his workshop, in his furniture making workshop in London. And one day in the workshop the phone rang, so I dusted off all the sawdust, picked up the phone, and it was Maggie Boddy from Hobbenstadt, half a mile away, saying, "You won the Boardman Tasker Prize."
Wow.
So that was very thrilling, because I'd always admired the books of Joe Tasker and Peter Boardman. They've been a great inspiration, so it was a great thrill to win their prize.
So you had arrived, no, the literally scene and climbing scene, both.
Well, it'd be nice to say it's guaranteed me security and riches for life, but it didn't. But it was a nice little boost.
Yeah. So, after the Boardman Tasker Prize, you went climbing in '87, you said. Yeah. Where was that?
86, 87 was a great time. I was living in London in the house of Victor and Maggie Saunders. Victor's a very fine mountaineer, and Maggie climbed as well in those days. And it was quite a hot house of mountaineering activity, and there's this strange what's the word I'm looking for? There's this strange paradox that if you're in a big city far from the mountains, you often end up doing more climbing than if you're close to the mountains, because there's that kind of urban energy and competitiveness, and there were a lot of good climbers in London, and that was quite inspiring. And I think that helped make me think, I've really got to grab the nettle and make a go of this thing. And that winter of 1987, I went many times up to Scotland with Victor and other people, and there were some stunning climbers like Mick Fowler, some really outstanding climbers, and that helped sort of inspire you to try and do better things. And two things happened that spring in '87. Victor said, "Do you want to come and climb the north face of Spantic, which is this stunning pillar in the Karakoram, which I fantasized about but not dared to think about seriously." And I thought, wow, that would be fantastic. And then about a week later he said, "Well, no, actually, I'm going to go and climb it with Mick Fowler, so you're not coming after all." So I thought, right, okay, well, I'll have to go and organise my own trip. So I got together with an old friend called Phil Bartlett, who loves mountain exploration, and a younger climber called Duncan Tunstall, who lived in London, who was keen to visit the great ranges. And we went off to the Karakoram, and we decided to do a more fluid, mobile expedition with no fixed objectives, more of a horizontal than a vertical journey. And we were loosely calling ourselves the 50th anniversary Blank on the Map expedition, because it was 50 years after ships in Tillman, Spender and Auden and Angtake and those amazing Sherpas had done their famous exploration of the Karakoram in 1937. So 50 years on, three of us arrived. We weren't going to go to the Shack Scan, but I'd always fancied the idea of going to the Biafo Glacier to Snow Lake. So that's what we set off to do. And with the help of porters, we got to the head of the Biafo Glacier, and from there it was just the three of us on our own. We didn't see anyone else for the next 3 weeks. We explored various passes. Duncan and I attempted an unclimbed peak, which we later called the Solu Tower. We then went over the Kurdapin Pass, just the three of us, down the Kurdapin Glacier to Shimshal. It was a big adventure. And then Phil and Duncan had to go home, back to work. I didn't have a regular job, the story of my life. So I teamed up with someone called Steve Rossetti, who's a very enthusiastic and experienced trekker. And we went up the Hisbar Glacier, back to Snow Lake, and then I completed the ascent of the Solu Tower on my own, which was left me feeling that I didn't have any regrets. And then Rossetti and I made our way out over the Soka Pass, which I don't think had been crossed since 1939. And then I made my way right the way down to Islamabad, and then right the way down through the Sindh desert on the train down to Karachi. And there I boarded a flight. I think in Karachi I was down to about 100 rupees. My funds were at an end. But there was salvation in the form of it was called the Jade Venture Expedition to Shishapangma, because I was joining an expedition to Tibet. So I boarded the plane to Kathmandu and joined up with an expedition led by a great friend called Henry Day, in conjunction with a famous and eccentric English explorer called John Blashford Snell. And we were going to Shishapangma, the world's third highest mountain, initially trekking through the Jubal Himal in Nepal. My first visit to Nepal, God, it was a wonderful treat. And then over Friendship Highway up to Nyalam in Tibet. And then we went to attempt a new route up the east face of Shishapangma, which was my first attempt on an 8,000 meter peak. And it was a very enjoyable expedition. It was a slightly incongruous expedition. I mean, it was a large team. I think we had about 10 climbers, old-fashioned sort of siege style. Henry even brought some oxygen. He was a great believer in oxygen. We fixed ropes on the hard sections. But I enjoyed the companionship, and I enjoyed the adventure of going up a side of the mountain which had never been attempted before. We decided the east face direct on Shishapangma looked too dangerous, so we did a sort of flanking movement. This is a very military expedition, a flanking manoeuvre, round up the side of a satellite peak called Pumpari. And the curious thing, without trying to sound too boastful, was I arrived thin but fit from the Karakoram and very well acclimatised. So almost by default, I ended up leading virtually every pitch on the mountain, right the way up through the icefall and up Pumpari. And we got to a high point on Pumpari at about 7,000 metres, which was my sort of altitude record still. And then we got hit by a huge storm, which swept right through the Himalayas. A terrific storm. Many people died in that storm. Thank God no one died on our team. But, we were just inundated with the heaviest snowfall I'd ever seen. And after the storm abated, everything changed. Winter seemed to have arrived, but we still had just about enough gear and supplies to have an attempt. And Henry said very kindly that Luke Hughes and I should make the summit attempt, partly because we'd been down at base camp resting during the storm, so we were in reasonably fit shape. So basically over the next 6 days, Luke and I broke trail all the way back up the mountain and on, up to the summit of Pumpari, which was a second ascent, and then we cut loose, travelling light, and in a long day we got to about 7,500 metres on this very extended ridge on Shishapangma. But by late afternoon we obviously weren't going to get to the summit, so we had to stop and bivouac. So we had to bivouac at about 7,500 metres without a sleeping bag, tent. At the end of October, it was a bloody cold night, but we dug a snow cave and we survived. But in the morning it became obvious that really we couldn't continue to the summit, so rather reluctantly I agreed to retreat. And it was quite a sobering experience. I remember getting back to our tent, having been gone for 2 days and feeling just completely wiped out, and really having to concentrate on survival. But we all retreated safely. 2 more people climbed Pumpari, and we stripped the mountain and made our way back down.
So after this now, by this time you were married?
At this stage in my life, 1987, I had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with a girl called Rosie Greaves Cook, and quite a stormy relationship. And I'd just been away in the Himalayas for 4 months. I got back to London and saw Rosie again, but then I announced that in early February I'd be leaving again for another 4 months because I'd been invited to go to Mount Everest, and it wasn't really the sort of invitation you can turn down. Not really because it was Everest, but because it was Everest in a very special way, by a new route up the biggest face with a team of just 4 climbers without a budget for oxygen equipment. So it was going to be a big, big adventure.
So how did that invitation came to you? People knew you in America, or you had some common friends?
This Everest invitation really came out of the blue. And it was all thanks to John Hunt, who had led the first ascent of Everest, because he had been invited to be honorary leader of an American team calling themselves the 35th anniversary expedition. So Robert Anderson, the expedition leader, had asked John Hunt to be honorary leader. John Hunt said, well, I'd love to do that, but you really ought to have a British climber, and why don't you get in contact with Venables?
So he knew by that time quite well.
Yeah, I knew John reasonably well, and he realised that I was quite experienced and ambitious. And bless him, he put my name forward. So Anderson got in touch with me, and in January I went to meet him in New York, and we got on well together, and I liked him and liked the sound of his plans, and I knew that he'd already got Ed Webster on board. Ed Webster was a leading American climber. Another American, well, strictly Canadian climber called Paul Tier, who's obviously very experienced. And ideally, Robert wanted to have 6 climbers, but in the end we just had 4, which was cutting it pretty fine. But I rather liked that, because I knew we'd all have a good share of the fun. And I just knew, you know, sometimes you set off on an expedition, you just know this one's going to be special. It just has a good sort of karma to it. And I knew this was going to be a great adventure, and it was.
So you all gelled well, and you went from Kathmandu to base camp in the north.
Yes, the 1988 Anglo-American-Canadian Everest expedition, it really broke all the rules of teamwork and management. I'd only met Robert briefly for 3 days in New York. I never met Webster and Paul Tier, and they never met me until I arrived in Kathmandu. And I arrived in Kathmandu not even knowing where they were. I eventually bumped into Paul in a street in Tamil, and he said, "Ah, Venables!" And he took me back to the hotel, and then I met Pasang Norbu, who was the expedition cook, delightful man, and yeah, we just sort of, well, you make a go of it. You thought, well, we're going to spend the next 3 months together. We're going to have to get on. We did.
So how was the climb now? Can you just tell us briefly? I mean, you know, new route, Kangshung Face, and your summit experience.
Okay. The Kangshung Face climb was really all thanks to Ed Webster. It was his idea. Basically, he looked at some photos and thought there was a possibility of a new route up the left-hand side of the Kangshung Face, which no one had ever considered before. So it really should be called the Webster route. And that was the plan, the vague plan when we set out. When we eventually got to base camp after a 23-day approach from Carter, we began to look at it more closely, and there was this wonderful growing excitement as we realised this sort of vague idea of Webster's could become a reality. And that was very, very exciting. I mean, mountaineering at its best is quite creative, and you're drawing a line up a mountain, creating something. So it was just thrilling. And I'll always remember the very first day, April the 3rd, 1988, when I actually set foot on Everest for the first time. And that morning I was climbing with Robert, the expedition leader, and we made quite quick progress. It had taken us so long to get to base camp, we were really well acclimatized. And we fixed several rope lengths, and then we came to this steep wall of quartzite and granite and shale and quartz and these wonderful bands of rock. And Robert, who's very laid back, said, "Oh, I haven't been doing much climbing recently, you better lead this." So there I led the first hard pitch, and it was just blissful. And that really set the tone for the expedition. And we took turns to lead. Webster, Tier, Anderson and myself. So everyone had a turn leading. It was just a wonderful journey through some extraordinary landscape. And we worked away at the initial buttress. That took 6 days. We then got stopped by a huge crevasse. That set us back quite a bit. It was only about 10 days later we finally dealt with the crevasse. And it was really Webster who did it with some inspired ice climbing up the far wall of the crevasse to create a rope bridge. Eventually we pushed through to about 7,500 meters, established a second camp. That was on May Day, and then we had about a week of bad weather. And eventually, in the second week of May, we set off on our summit push. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done.
So how you became alone going to the top? Others stopped in between?
Well, the final summit push, the plan was 5 days up, 2 days down. In the end, the plan was 4 days up and about 1 day down. In the end, it took 9 days. Day to Camp 1, rest at Camp 1, then a long, long day to Camp 2, breaking trail, heavy snow, deep snow, back-breaking work. Day 3, for Webster and Tier and me was higher than any of us had been before. 11 hours, new terrain, finally emerging onto the South Col late that afternoon. Got to the South Col, bitter, cold winds. It's the most god-awful place. Got the tents up, got through the night as best we could, but during the night, Paul Tier felt pretty ropey. By the morning it was obvious that he had warning signs of potential edema. So the only sensible thing for Paul to do was to go down. Being wise and brave, he said, I'm going to do that. He set off down. Anderson and Webster and I stayed up on the South Col. Very windy day, but during the afternoon the wind abated. And by that evening we said, okay, we'll give it a go. So that night we set off for the summit. And Robert Anderson, who's a great expedition leader, he never would tell people what to do, but we did have a bit of a sort of powwow where he basically said, well, you know, summit day without oxygen, we don't know if any of us can do it. We'll just see how far we can go, really. Each person should just push himself as hard as he wants to see how far he can get. Initially we roped up, but it didn't seem to work because we were all moving at different speeds, so we unroped, which Webster wasn't entirely happy with, but so we unroped, and then I was basically ahead, breaking trail. And it was just a long journey. And that day, all of us got to the South Summit, but...
and you camped there?
No.
In South Col you had a camp?
We left our tents in the South Col, so it's a long day. It's 900 meters from the South Col to the summit, and I mean these Sherpas who do these speed ascents now, they do it. Well, they do it in about 11 hours from base camp.
Yeah.
It took me 16 and a half hours from the South Col to the summit, and Webster and Anderson were even slower. And they didn't get to the South Summit until it was nearly dark, and they just had to turn back. I got to the South Summit at about 1:30 in the afternoon, 1 o'clock maybe, and so it seemed justifiable to continue. So I continued, and having almost ground to a halt below the South Summit, after the South Summit, with the excitement of the final ridge and the Hillary Step, that gave me a bit of a boost, and I climbed the Hillary Step and eventually got to the summit at 20 to 4 in the afternoon, and at 10 to 4 in the afternoon I turned around and headed back down again. And my big fear, the nightmares back in London, had always been about getting to the summit of Everest and then finding strength to get down. And there was a very sobering statistic, because at that stage in 1988 20 people had reached the summit without oxygen during the previous 10 years. 20 people, and 4 of them had not returned. So that was a pretty sobering statistic. So I was very anxious. I was scared, you know. I hope to God that I've got some reserve to get back down again. And there were a couple of moments on the way back from the summit when I thought, oh God, you've blown it. Because I was just very weak, very tired, overextended. Descending the Hillary Step was exhausting. There was an awful moment when it was snowing and it was blowing, and my prescription sunglasses got completely iced over, so I couldn't see. So I pulled them off, and they're hanging down, and then I was thought, well, I'd better get out my ordinary glasses so I could see something. So I had to take off my mittens, and then I was fumbling with my zips trying to get out my glasses, and as I was fumbling I could feel my fingers going numb. I thought, no, well, you know, better to be blind than have no fingers. So I just put my mittens back on. It's a real struggle getting them back on. And I thought, I'll just have to manage without glasses. So then I was just going along with it. finding my way, because I'm very short-sighted. But I just had to manage. Anyway, I got back over the South Summit and carried on down, but I was far slower than I'd intended. Webster and Anderson had obviously turned back, there was no sign of them. So eventually, at about 8,600 meters, as it got dark, I thought, well, I won't. It's too silly to risk making a mistake in the dark. I'll stop and bivouac here. So I did it at about 8,600 meters. And at that stage, before that, only Jim Whitwire had done something similar on K2, alone at that altitude. This was a bit higher than Whitwire had been on K2. So it was a world record for a solo bivouac. But someone's got to do it. And I was lucky because the wind died down. It was a windless night. And that meant I didn't have to dig a snow cave, which is just as well, because I don't think I had the strength to dig a snow cave. So I just scraped out a ledge in the snow and lay down and waited.
So you were completely sitting in open? No
Completely
sleeping bag covering you, no jackets? Or...
No, I was just in the clothing I was wearing. But I selected my clothing very carefully. At the back of my mind, I think, was always the thought, well, just supposing you got caught out, would you be able to survive? Only based it on experience. Now, a few months earlier on Shishapangma, I'd had to bivouac without a sleeping bag and I'd survived. So I thought, well, this is 1,000 meters higher, but there you go. And I knew that Doug Scott and Dougal Haston had bivouacked even higher in October, well, end of September. And Doug Scott hadn't even had a duvet jacket. Well, Doug is better, he has more natural insulation than me. He's a big lad, but I thought, well, if he can do it without a duvet jacket, I ought to be able to do it with all the gear I've got. So I was pretty confident of surviving. It was just, I knew it was just going to be a long, shivering wait till the dawn. But eventually it came to an end.
In the book you write about the presence of an old man with beard.
Oh, yes.
So what was that all about?
Well, during that summit day, I think all of us experienced various hallucinations, which is fairly normal under that kind of stress. In my case, I had this increasing sense of an old man walking along beside me, accompanying me, and he came and went. And at times it felt quite intense, this presence of another person. And when it came to bivouacking, actually, I kept projecting onto this old man. I said, oh, he's so tired, poor old man. Well, we'll put him down here and he can sit on this rock, sit here, and be better. And because rocks are warmer than snow, better insulation. Oh, poor old man, he keeps sliding off the rock. Maybe we should get him somewhere to lie down. Okay, well, I'll cut him a bed in the snow and then he can lie down in the snow. And, oh dear, he's a bit cold. But some people have come to help warm up his feet. And they're not doing very well. And then at some stage, these people had personalities. So, Mike Scott's here to warm up my hands. And Eric Shipton, he put in an appearance. They came and went, these people, during the night. Sometimes lots of people. And at one point I thought, go away, you're all taking, there's not enough room on this ledge, go away, leave me in peace. And you're not getting my feet warm anywhere, they're completely numb, so you might as well go away. Strange, drifting in and out of reality.
And morning when you started coming down without cold.
Yeah, it was a lovely moment when I realised it was no longer dark. I was still alive. So I got up and I continued down. I can find my way now quite clearly. I got down to an old abandoned Japanese tent at about 8,400 meters, 8,500 meters. And there were Robert and Ed, because they'd spent the night in this tent. And they were in pretty ropey shape too. And the three of us went together back down to the South Col. I think I was the weakest though. And we got back to our tent Robert went into one tent, I shared a tent with Webster. And then we started to inspect the damage. My hands were okay, but poor old Ed had frostbitten the tips of all his fingers and one thumb. I had frostbitten the toes of on my left foot. So we weren't in brilliant shape, but my God, it was good to be back in our tent. Warm sleeping bag, stove, cup of tea. It was blissful. But that day I had a scary experience where I suddenly thought I was choking. And I remembered Somerville on Everest in 1924, alone, when Norton had gone ahead, and he suddenly found himself choking. And I remembered he thought he was about to die and then gave himself a Heimlich maneuver. So I tried doing the same, and I coughed up this horrible golden blue phlegm. I started breathing again. So that crisis passed, and we just lay there all day, resting. And the day passed, and it wasn't until the next morning
And had you eaten anything during all this ordeal?
Down at the South Pole we did have a little food, but finding it harder and harder to eat. But we had tea, we had something to drink. And we were so desperate to sleep, against all our better instincts, we stayed there that day. So by the following day we'd been on the South Pole for nearly 4 days, which was obviously not ideal. And that morning this sort of terrible lassitude started to take over. And by that stage, Webster and I had run out of gas. But Robert in the other tent still had some gas. He kept saying, I'll bring you some tea, I'll bring you some tea. But it seemed to take forever. We were all getting lazier and lazier and more lethargic. And it seemed to spend most of the day just literally to pack our rucksacks, put our boots on. It was pathetic. And eventually we got going. And we didn't get going till late that afternoon. It was just crazy. And we set off back down the east face. And for some reason, I thought we wouldn't need the rope. I left the rope behind, which was really stupid. So we set off without the rope, even though there was some, crevassed terrain.
Just a minute now, I will just...
Sorry.
Yeah. So we were at Everest and you got down to the base camp. And coming back, was any problem anywhere? And you were immediately a hero? Grand reception at Kathmandu, Mumbai, everywhere? Or London?
Yeah. I sort of feel we were at the end of a golden age of Everest climbing. Because there've been so many exciting things happening in the 80s. And we'd had this chance to do this new route. Great adventure. And the great thing about Everest in those days is that we had no satellite communication. We didn't even have radios on the mountain. We had no communication with the outside world. And I got to the summit on May the 12th. And no one in the world knew about it. In fact, no one in the world knew about it until June the 2nd. So there was this lovely sense of isolation, and instead of everything having to be instant, and it meant you could present the story in your own way, send out an accurate, detailed press release. But it was a strange experience, because first we had to get down the mountain, we had to get down the east face. That was a grueling, epic, extraordinary. Then we had to shuffle our way back to base camp across the Kangshung Glacier on frostbitten feet. Then we had to wait there for the porters to arrive, and then we had to, it was another 4 days to get back to the roadhead on very sore feet. Eventually staggered back to the roadhead, and eventually Paul and I went back to Kathmandu, the others went to Beijing. And to get back to Kathmandu we had no money. We had to get all the gear back, to sell the gear, to pay for my flight back to Bombay, for our hotels. So we had to catch a lift off. We had to borrow some money from some Americans to pay for some porters to carry the gear across the frontier. And then we got down into Nepal, and we had nothing to pay for transport back to Kathmandu. So Paul commandeered an empty bus, and then there were a few tourists coming down from Tibet. So he'd stop them all and say, right, Kathmandu, that'll be, $20. And then he had enough money to pay for the bus and to buy a crate of beer. So we had a very merry journey back to Kathmandu. But we arrived there literally penniless. But then we could sell off all the gear to pay our bills. And eventually I made my way back to Mumbai to collect some stuff there, where Geeta Kapadia very kindly put up with my stinky, rotting toes, and eventually made my way back to London. But it was classic. Some travel agent had written the wrong time on my ticket, and so Geeta, bless her, phoned up the airport at 4 o'clock in the morning and said, just checking that the flight's leaving on time. Said, no, the flight left half an hour ago. Oh. It was the wrong time. So we got to Mumbai airport, and I'd missed the flight. So I was there saying, don't you realise the great British public, 3 million television viewers, expect me to be there tonight on the Terry Wogan show. I have to be there. So bless them, eventually someone got me onto I think it was a Gulf Air flight. And then we went to the Gulf, and then there was a detour to Paris, and the BBC was phoning saying, don't worry, we'll get in there in time. Eventually I arrived at Heathrow Airport. I was whisked out of the plane on a wheelchair, whisked through. It's great. Red carpet treatment.
And then what? I mean, was interview and everything?
Yeah, and there were all the cameras and the lights. And what was it like, Mr. Venables? And people pushing microphones. It was just like on the telly. And I was whisked through, and the BBC said, no, he's going to the Wogan show. They've got first rights. Whisked into a limousine and whisked off to the theatre in London, Shepherd's Bush in London. And my sister-in-law, bless her, had gone to get me a clean pair of trousers. And then I came onto the studio in my crutches, clean trousers. It was this chap, Terry Wogan, and his evening chat show was the sort of big evening show at that time, live. So that was all good fun.
And but what about the physical things? You have to go through operations and treatments?
Yes, well, I arrived back with 3.5 rotten toes. By that stage, it was obvious that they were goners. There was nothing savable. So I spent the summer waiting to have my toes cut off. While I was doing that, I started writing my Everest book. And then I had a brief pause while I went into hospital to have the toes amputated. And then I continued on crutches. And then they healed very well, very quickly. Thanks to an excellent nurse who put excellent dressings on them. And then I started walking again. And eventually, one day with Rosie, started climbing again in North Wales.
And you married Rosie by now, or not yet?
No, things were still
far.
a little ambivalent.
Okay. So now, how long you were sort of time before you got really fit? 88 and 89, 90, 91, 2-3 years you took?
I think by the autumn of 1988 I was feeling pretty fit again.
Very good.
Going climbing again. I'm putting some weight back on. Unlike poor old Ed Webster, he lost all his fingertips. He had to have a lot of operations, and I think he had a very traumatic time. I was much luckier. And certainly by Christmas I felt fine. Although just before Christmas I went out to do a lecture tour in Ireland, and the Irish love to make fun of the British. And they sent me up some secret climb. I said, it's not hard, it's only one. Of course, I got completely stuck. Gibbering wreck. And they were shouting, so was it like this on the South Car line, Mr. Venables? Made a complete fool of myself. But I was certainly feeling a lot fitter. And I was pretty busy that winter on a big lecture tour.
And your book was also completed within a year or two?
Yeah, bless them, Hodder and Stout brought the book out on the first anniversary of our summit day. And Maggie Body was wonderful because she pulled all the stops out. I kept pushing for another, 16-page section of colour pictures. Eventually they went to 48 pages of colour and integrated black and white pictures. And she took a lot of trouble on it and persuaded Hodder to spend a lot of money on it.
But that sold very well, the book.
Yes, books never sell as well as I hope, but it did pretty well, yeah. And it's now been in print for, it's now out of print, but it was in print for 15 years or so.
So then, what next major thing happened, expedition-wise or in your life?
After Everest, I got enough money from the Everest Advance to buy a car for the first time in my life. And then following summer, Rosie decided that she would take a big risk and live with me, and we got a house, but not in London, but in Bath, about 100 miles away. Then shortly after moving into that little house, I disappeared for 4 months to go on an expedition to South Georgia. So Rosie went off to work in the Alps. I went to South Georgia. Really, it was all thanks to a man called Julian Freeman Atwood, who I met on Shishapangma. And he was keen to go there, and he came up with this idea and he said, why don't we give it a go? And we invited my old friend Lindsay Griffin and Brian Davison, who's a brilliant climber, and an excellent Dutch filmmaker called Kees het Hooft. And off we went to South Georgia in the Southern Ocean. Completely new experience. And, we made a film for ITV, we made some first ascents. It was a great adventure.
So then, by this time you were absolutely in the now mainstream of climbing. So how did you sort of join up with Bonington for your main expedition? 92 Panchachuli?
Yes. Back in '88, Kapadia and I nearly put together an expedition to the Panchachuli Mountains in Garhwal. And then I got invited to go to Everest, so rather selfishly I said, look, do you mind if we abandon that idea for the moment, because I really want to go on this Everest expedition. And then in I think it was about the summer of 1990, I was in the bar with Bonington in Wales, and he said, I'm going on this expedition to a mountain called Panchachuli with this chap Kapadia. And I said, yeah, I know all about Kapadia and Panchachuli. He said, well, would you like to come? So I said, well, we'll see, it's your expedition now, is it? Well, fair enough. World's most famous mountaineer, why not? So yes, please, very nice. I'd love to come to Panchachuli. So we had another joint Indian expedition.
You knew Bonington well by now, or before that?
I met him a few times, yes. I knew him reasonably well. As a young man, he'd been the ultimate successful mountaineer, and I read his books. I sort of had fantasy dreams of being invited to go with him to Everest in 1975, an unknown student. But now it was a reality that I was going on a Bonington Kapadia expedition, and very exciting it was. What had actually happened the previous autumn, I went with Davison and Dick Renshaw to Nepal to climb a new route on Kusum Kangaroo, which was a lovely climb. And that November in '91, I was coming back down the valley from Kusum Kangaroo with Dick. We climbed this beautiful route. Looking forward to getting back to Rosie, and we now have a baby son, Ollie. Couldn't wait to get back to see them. And then Dick said, oh bloody hell, we've got to go back to the Himalayas in 3 months' time. God, this is hard work, because the following May we were due to come out again to Panchachuli. So actually that was a bit of a wrench, leaving my 11-month-old baby. But anyway, it was good to get back to Mumbai and meet the old gang. And we all set off for Garhwal.
So then, Panchachuli was a great experience. Which peaks you climbed?
Excuse me. The Panchchuli, well, it was a bit explosive. The Panchchuli expedition was a great adventure. It was another joint expedition, Indian-British. So we had all that fun and companionship. I suppose it was a slight pity that it wasn't a truly joint expedition in that the Brits, when it came to the actual summit climbs, we tended to climb separately. But we had all the fun of travelling together and sharing base camp and advanced base camp. And sharing the job of putting the route up through the ice falls. And then in the end what happened was that on my part of the expedition I teamed up with Victor Saunders, Stephen Venables and Dick Renshaw, and basically Kapadia pointed us at a long, long unclimbed ridge over a peak called Manaka and up to Rajaramba, 6,300 and something metres I think. And that was lovely, just 5 days following this long, long ridge up the mountain and back down. And we were really quite satisfied with that. And then right at the end of the expedition, those of us who remained made our way round into the Pyunchani Valley, which was actually the valley I'd always really wanted to look at, because there were these unclimbed summits of Panchchuli 3, 4, 5. And while Kapadia and Contractor went to explore some previously untrodden passes, the four of us Brits plus Chris Bonington decided we'd see if we could snatch one of those big unclimbed summits. And in the end, rather perversely and rather against Bonington's wishes, we went for Panchchuli 5, which was the highest and most difficult to get at. But I'm always tempted by things that look a little unattainable. So we went for Panchchuli 5, and it was pretty committing because we had to find a way up through some quite tortuous ice falls. So a long, difficult, committing approach at a time when the monsoon was approaching, so temperatures were starting to get a bit uncomfortably warm and everything was starting to disintegrate, but we thought we'll just push through and see if we can snatch this on the last day of the expedition, which we did. 4 of us made it to the summit of Panchchuli 5. Unfortunately, during this descent, in the middle of the night, well, towards the end of the night, an abseil anchor failed and I fell 300 meters. Sorry, I fell 300 feet down the mountain, broke both my legs, which was pretty inconvenient. So the others had to get me down. It was a long, long, hard day with a lot of pain and tiredness. And eventually, 4 days later, thanks to 2 brave Indian Air Force pilots, I was plucked to safety. Somewhat chastened, but it was a great expedition.
So how long it took you to recover from Panchchuli? Injuries?
I was very lucky not to have any spinal injuries or head injuries or internal injuries. On my left leg was a simple fracture of the ankle, but my right knee was pretty badly smashed up. So when I got back to Britain, I spent 5 weeks in hospital. I had 3 operations altogether, I think. And another operation 18 months later to remove the metal. So my right knee has never been quite the same again. But it functions well enough. And 9 months to the day after the accident, I did my first rock climb. Wow. So it was like a pregnancy. And Kapadia was there, cheering us on, and it was in Bonington. At a little cliff called the Roaches, and it was a rather sort of cold early spring day. And I was pretty nervous. I thought, well, I've got to bite the bullet. So Chris led the route, I followed. It was 9 months to the day since the accident on. Panchchuli.
So then after that, did you return to the Himalayan mountains or not much for climbing?
Well, at the time of the Panchchuli expedition, I think at the time of the Panchchuli expedition, rather like Renshaw, I was beginning to feel slightly ambivalent about these long committing expeditions and trying to combine them with having a family. And perhaps the accident was the writing on the wall. Anyway, for whatever reason, I stopped going on such committing expeditions. And a year later, our second son, Edmund, was born. And that really made it impractical to go on big expeditions. And it was only in 1995 I did go on another expedition with Jim Wickwire and John Roskelly, two outstanding American climbers, and the Australian climber Tim McCartney's Snake, and Charlie Porter, another outstanding American climber. We went to Tierra del Fuego, to Monte Sarmiento, but that was just for 4 weeks, so not too long away. And subsequently, I've really limited myself. I keep dreaming about great Himalayan climbers, but wondering if I have the bottle, and wondering if I want to expose myself to the risk, and if I can find the money. So I've tended in recent years to do more commercial ventures, whether it's leading treks or doing filming projects in South Georgia and other places, working on IMAX films, television jobs. So there hasn't been the same single-minded drive and the same fun of, creating a new route, but it's still a way of getting to the mountains.
So what about Oli, your son? I believe he was not too well. Past when you had some tragedies with your house also, this fire and all.
Yes.
So what was all the aspects of your life?
The 1990s was quite a dramatic and trying decade for me and Rosie. I had my bad accident in 1992. While I was away on Panchchuli, Rosie had a miscarriage, but as soon as I got back, she got pregnant again, and then our second son, Edmund, was born in 93, and then, life was looking up. But then, by the end of 1993, it was obvious that something was wrong with our something was wrong with our eldest son, Ollie, and he was no longer talking, he was behaving very oddly. And to this day, we wonder whether he didn't have a brain tumour all along. But for whatever reason, he was diagnosed as having autism. And that was a huge shock. This beautiful, very bright, very outgoing, very clever boy, suddenly with this huge neurological disability. So that was a reason, really, that committed expeditions became impossible. And even going for a month to Tierra del Fuego in 1995 was questionable. So for Rosie, it was a long quest to find ways of fighting this autism, trying to make Ollie better. And it was made doubly challenging for Ollie because he got very ill at the end of 1995 in the middle of moving house. And as we moved into our new house, he became weaker and weaker and weaker, and crying and crying and crying, in huge pain, but no one knew what was wrong with his legs. And none of the doctors could work out what was wrong. And eventually, I was away lecturing in Scotland, and before going to Scotland, I'd telephoned. The doctor said, "You have to admit this boy to hospital for casualty." And while I was up in Scotland, a phone call came from Rosie to say, bad news, Ollie's got leukemia. And I thought, traditionally, leukemia was like a death sentence, but in fact, I hadn't realised things had changed. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which the one children tend to get is actually curable. But the cure is long and hard, and halfway through he had a relapse in the central nervous system, so he then had to have radiation, and all this he had to endure without, as far as we can tell, understanding much language. So you think, why are people doing these things to me? So for Ollie it was a long and difficult struggle, which took 3 years of chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And meanwhile, he couldn't talk, he behaved very oddly, he had all sorts of strange phobias. It was a difficult time. And towards the end of the leukemia, Rosie decided that we should educate him at home. And so we embarked on a long home education program, which involved employing all sorts of helpers and volunteers. That really completely dominated our lives, until eventually Ollie went away in 2000. He started at a special residential school, which was a huge, huge wrench, but we decided in the end that was the best. And so he was in special school full time. And so we used to see him at weekends. And really our life was entirely planned around weekends when Ollie came home. And eventually we had a system where every alternate weekend Ollie would come home. And we'd all get more and more excited, and then Friday afternoon either me or Rosie would drive up to near Birmingham where his school was, and he was always there waiting, looking out of the window. It was thrilling to see him. He'd come home and the weekend would be dominated by Ollie. And by Sunday evening everyone was exhausted, the house was mayhem. And we'd say, okay Ollie, time to go back to school, and one of us would drive him back on a Sunday night. There was always a sad moment leaving him on Sunday night. And I remember Christmas at the end of 2002, having Christmas with Ollie not at home, and Rosie said, this is awful, we can't keep doing this. What we should do is we'll go and live near Birmingham, near to Ollie. So we got very excited with the idea that we would go and move, or at least rent a house near to his school, and then we could see him, every day. And that's getting very exciting. Oh, we'll be nearer to Wales and closer to the rock climbing, all sorts of possibilities. And so we were all set to do that, but unfortunately in 2003 it became obvious that summer that Ollie was very ill, and then none of the doctors recognised that he was ill, but Rosie knew he was very ill. And in the autumn of 2003 he got iller and iller and iller, and something was clearly very, very wrong. And eventually he got so bad we took him away from school, brought him home, and one doctor twigged what was happening and sent him in to be scanned. He had a CT scan, and then the doctor said I wanted to come back from an MRI scan. The following day he had the MRI scan, and sure enough he had a brain tumour. And I still wonder, it was oligodendroglioma, and there are recorded cases of people who had that tumour undiagnosed for up to 20 years. And he never had an MRI scan until that point. And I always think, just supposing that tumour was there all the time, on the left hand side, on the speech centre, it might have explained all those strange behaviours. Anyway, we will never know, but at this stage the tumour was that big, and he had it out the next day, and immediately it was much better. I'm happy. But sadly, a couple of weeks later he suddenly got very ill again, and for whatever reason there was an opportunistic infection of the chickenpox virus, and 2 days later he died, which really put climbing mountains into perspective.
Just a minute. So Steve, now continuing with this, can we just conclude with lot of few people, famous personalities, or any friends you have met among mountaineering circles? Did you meet Eric Shipton, or did you meet any of that?
Okay.
And your work as a president of the Alpine Club London.
Well, where are we? Who are I? Well, over the years I've been lucky enough to climb with some of the best mountaineers in the world. I mean, when I was a student, I used to read about Joe Tasker and Dick Renshaw and the amazing things they were doing, and then I ended up climbing with Dick Renshaw. I read books by Chris Bollington. I ended up climbing with him. Once I even went on an expedition with Reinhold Messner to take part in an IMAX movie.
Oh wow!
Yes, it was on South Georgia. Conrad Anker and myself and Reinhold Messner, following in the steps of Shackleton. I met some wonderful people, and Charlie Porter, John Ruskelly, India's most famous mountain explorer, Harish Kapadia, and all his friends. Victor Saunders I've climbed with a few times. Carlos Bueller, another great American climber. Tim McCartney's Snake, who was the first person to climb Everest from sea level. And they're all such nice people. I once did a little ski tour with Alison Hargreaves, one of the best women mountaineers there's ever been. I once had half an hour's bouldering at Fontainebleau with Catherine Destillat. What other names can I drop? Oh, one of the nice things was when I was president of the Alpine Club, it was during the 150th anniversary of the Alpine Club, and I decided we ought to celebrate in Zermatt. So we had a big party in Zermatt in the Alps, and we wanted to invite, someone outstanding and someone with an association with the Matterhorn. So I just thought I'd try, and I wrote to Walter Bonatti and said, would he come? And blow me, he said yes. And so that was thrilling. The great Walter Bonatti came, and he was utterly delightful and charming, and he was the star of the party. And he doesn't speak a word of English, but he speaks French with this heavy Italian accent, so we were able to communicate a bit. And he came with his wonderful wife, Rosanna, and it was a real treat to meet this real gentleman. And I met him again a couple of years later, and I'm particularly glad that I met this great hero, and because he suddenly died recently, aged just 82, I think. So it was a chance to meet him before he died. I wish I'd met Eric Shipton. I never met Eric Shipton. I always hoped I would. But I've met his sons, Nicky and John. John is in many ways following in his steps. I once briefly met Bill Tillman when I was very young, callow youth. He was terrifying. This tiny little man, this rather formidable little man. His moustache, military moustache. And then he disappeared in the South Atlantic about a year later, just before his 80th birthday. I do remember once meeting Noel O'Dell in the Alpine Club Library, and the Caradoc Jones, who subsequently became the first Welshman to climb Everest many years later. Anyway, Caradoc and I were there in the library, and there was this old gentleman sifting through some photos of the North Face of Everest, and very, very charming man, talking about it, how he'd been visiting some climbers in Japan, discussing routes up the second step and so on. And then he got up and left the room, and I said, wow, that was Noel O'Dell. And I said, no, that was Noel O'Dell! Oh my God!
And among the contemporaries, whom do you really admire, climb with? What are good climbers? The recent years?
Gosh.
Just a few, I mean, of who you have a personal experience. or you climbed with?
Well, I think some of the ones I mentioned. You know, climbing Renshaw.
Renshaw is still climbing?
No, he's given up expeditioning. Yes. No, Dick made a very clear decision. No more expeditions. He's concentrating on his sculpture. Victor Saunders continues to climb, but as a professional mountain guide.
But you never wanted to turn into professional mountain guide? Leading treks but not climbing?
The thought of being a full-time mountain guide is a very, very hard way to earn a living. And years ago I was planning to do that. I was considering it, and sometimes I regret that I didn't. But I think to have to go out every day, taking people climbing, and frequently taking them on the same old routes, I think it's a hard way to earn a living. So, like most things in my life, I've done a compromise. So I tend to do the odd trip where I'm not really a guide, but I'm a sort of leader, coordinator, and people pay to come. And we go somewhere nice like South Georgia, or next year it's the Antarctic Peninsula, or a Himalayan trek. And it's a way of earning a bit of money and enabling me to keep going to these places.
And you've written several books, so that also has inspired other people.
Yes, I continue to write books, and I continue to lecture, and I really enjoy that. I mean, when I was a student, I worked a lot on shows, usually on the technical side, and I thought how wonderful it would be to act, to be on the stage. And now that's what I do. I go around theatres and I have that buzz of waiting for the house lights to go down and then to walk onto the stage to tell stories, and I really enjoy doing that.
So now what about the future? Just to conclude, what do you expect next a decade will bring to you, or
just
what would you like? So what do you expect now future should bring? If you have a choice, what would you like? I mean,
I've never been able to make decisions, and I've never known what the future is going to bring, and that seems to be the way it is.
Yeah. And do you have any honors received? I mean, medals or MB, OB, or anything of that?
I was the first Briton to climb Everest without a title. No, I don't have any letters after my name or before my name. But I was very thrilled a few years ago to receive an obscure but very prestigious award called the King Albert Medal, which is in memory of the Albert Premier of Belgium, who was a keen climber. And it's this gold medal given to people who've in some way are deemed to have contributed to the mountain world. And like Harish Kapadia, I received it. And that was very thrilling. And actually, a well-known climber and commentator called Ian McNaught-Davis was there at the time. He said, well, far few people have received that have got the MBE. So that was nice.